Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and it is my honor and a privilege to introduce you to Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch, of which I have been an avid subscriber since it is launched. Jihad Watch is a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, where he is the Shillman Fellow. He is the author of the brand new book, The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS. He's the author of 18 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad. He's led seminars on Islam and jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, the United States Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and the U.S. intelligence community. He has discussed jihad, Islam, and terrorism at a workshop sponsored by the U.S. State Department and the German Foreign Ministry. He is a consultant with the Center for Security Policy, and you can follow him. And I strongly suggest you subscribe to jihadwatch.com and find out every day what this most amazing man, Robert Spencer, is doing on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis, exposing Islam for what it is, an ideology that is not a religion, an ideology that is not faith-based, an ideology that has one purpose and one purpose only, and that is the subjugation and the advancement of a caliphate to dominate the world under their form of government. Robert Spencer, an honor and a privilege to have you here with us.
The honor is all mine. Thank you.
Robert, this book, History of Jihad, is a one of a kind. As I looked out in Library of Congress, as I looked out in the library, no one has really charted this entire path and documented to the degree that you have in the pursuit of bringing a depth of understanding that there is more propaganda going on today in the world of Islam than the combination of the former Soviet Union, of the combination of the former Laotian, Vietnamese, Chinese communism, Red China, add Venezuela, add all that together, and it pales by comparison to the contents of this book. And so I want to ask you, one, what drove you to finally do this and bring it to light, and talk about some of the incredible discoveries and enlightenment that you personally, even though you knew so much about this subject, I know that this was a personal journey for you. And I want you to take us inside of Robert Spencer as you navigated these waters.
Absolutely. You know, this book is something I've wanted to write for years. And finally, I was able to get the chance to do it. I think that it is the crown and the culminating achievement of all the work I've been doing for the last 20 years, trying to raise awareness about this threat. People say, when I say that, they say, well, this doesn't mean you're going to stop. No, I'm not going to stop. But I don't know maybe I'll write a book about baseball or something, but I don't know at this point what else I'm going to say, I could say about this, because I kind of think that I didn't plan it this way, but this book, it works as a trilogy with two other books that I've written. One is The Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran. And a lot of people know nowadays, if people are aware of this threat, if they're aware of the nature and magnitude of what challenge the global jihad poses for us, they know the Quran is full of problematic passages. And I've written a biography of Muhammad, The Truth About Muhammad. Same thing. People know now Muhammad in general. They know that he was not Gandhi. He was not Martin Luther King. He was not Jesus by any stretch of the imagination. He is somebody who taught violence, committed acts of violence himself, encouraged it, rewarded it, and so on. And so this now completes the case with those two books, because this book is it shows how all this works out in history. In other words, when I quote the Quran, and you know, I'm sure you've encountered this as well, for 20 years now, people say, oh, well, sure, there are violent passages in the Quran, but there are violent passages in the Bible too. And I've actually written a book about that called Religion of Peace back in 2007. And the thing is, of course, that the violent passages in the Bible are nothing like the violent passages in the Quran. There's no open-ended command to wage war against unbelievers, as there are several in the Quran. But the thing is, people generally dismiss that, and they dismiss Muhammad, and they say, yes, I actually had this happen to me very recently. I was speaking at a very well-informed and very interested group, and they were shocked. And people who knew about the problems with jihad terror and knew about how it's inspired all too often by Quranic exhortations, they still were saying, wait a minute, I thought that Islamic history was full of periods of tolerance and peace and coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims. Well, this book shows that that's not the case, that what we have is actually 1,400 years of uninterrupted warfare, and that what we have in Islamic history is not multiculturalism, coexistence, respect, tolerance, all the things that the historians say today. I rely in this book on contemporary accounts, eyewitnesses, court historians of a lot of the Muslim rulers who had historians writing down what they did as it happened. And this was to show how glorious they were, and they often shows how brutal and violent they were. And I didn't want to get into what modern historians say because all too often they whitewash all this. But history is being used today to further the Islamization agenda. For example, there's a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., Akbar Ahmed. He's 75 years old. He has had diplomatic experience. I believe he was the Pakistani ambassador to the U.S., and now he lives in the U.S. He's a professor here. And he's honored everywhere. He is very well respected, and he has immense power and influence in terms of influencing the way people look at current day public policy. And Akbar Ahmed has written a book called Journey into Europe, which is an astonishingly dishonest book, where he says that what we need is a new Al-Andalusia, and that Andalusia, Muslim Spain, was this wonderful, tolerant, multicultural place, and that's what Europe needs to be today. And so he is rewriting history, because Andalusia, as I show in this book, was anything but tolerant and peaceful. He's rewriting history in order to further the agenda of mass Muslim migration into Europe today. And people are being manipulated by these false historical claims into supporting public policies today that are detrimental to our free societies and our future. So I wrote this book to try to set the record straight about a lot of these historical myths, and I hope to influence policy by this book, and that policymakers will see it, and will see that a great deal of our foreign and domestic policies are based on false pretenses that we need to recognize as such and discard now.
I saw a picture in, I believe, 1952, might have been 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower invited the Muslim Brotherhood to the White House. And
1953. I'm not familiar with that. You got me on this.
Yeah.
The Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood to the White House in 1953.
Yes, to talk to them about the oil, because of our oil relations and oil dependencies in the Middle East. He wanted to meet with the leaders, and so all the sheikhs and all the leaders are there gathered in the White House. There's quite a lot of them gathered together, and I know it was Eisenhower. The year could be off. I was born in '52, so Eisenhower was just being inaugurated the following year. But the picture was unnerving to me, because as I looked at the Muslim Brotherhood's infiltration into American government and into American politics and into American corporations, this goes back to the 20s, and this Islamization and advancement was a colonization strategy as much as it was a military strategy. So conquest became jihad, as we look at jihad as being an embattlement. There were layers of embattlement. There was first penetration strategy through immigration and migration. There were strategic tipping points from a social standpoint. At 2%, ineffective. My next door neighbor's Muslim, great guy. See him at the gas station, see him at the ball game, kid plays ball. 4%, everything's copacetic. They're starting to get established. 6 and 8%, all of a sudden now there's a little bit of division. When we get to that 8% tipping point, the dynamics change. Now we have government. We have people running for government. We now have activism. 10%, we now have no-go zones. 15%, we're beginning to have domination. 20% is now demands. It's been a sociological study that has shown us exactly what the strategies and tactics. But here in the West, we seem to be so brain dead in regards to looking at what happened in sub-Saharan Africa, what happened in Eastern Europe, what happened in Western Europe, to believe arrogantly that this is not already here and it's not already in its way here. And so what you've done in this history is you said, you know what, I'm going to go against the grain of opinion. I'm not going to be labeled an Islamophobe. I'm going to be labeled a historian. Okay? I'm going to move myself from being the Jihad Watch guy to being the Muslim historian. And I think that you actually accomplished that. You took a hard break from just reporting on here's all these episodes under Jihad Watch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to document historically this pattern, which is a distinct, clear battle plan. It's no different than any battle plan that's ever been laid out through the course of history. Adolf Hitler had a battle plan. It was to start here, move here, point to point to point to point to point. When we went into each war, we had a battle plan. There is a war room. The war room happens to be the imams, the mosques, and the seeds of government, which are calling the shots about the Islamization of various territories. And Europe has fallen.
To a great degree, certainly, but it ain't over.
No.
I think that there's a real positive force emerging in Europe now with the Visegrad group, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Austria. Well, actually, Austria is not part of it, but they have the same policies, and Poland, and they are resisting the pressure from the European Union to admit this mass Muslim migration. And there is significant support for Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, and Germany has the Alliance for Germany, which is threatening the chancellorship of Angela Merkel. So it's, I would say, certainly the situation in Europe is very dire. And everything that you sketch out about the infiltration and the Islamization is absolutely true. This has been a hydra, which is a concept that is as old as Islam itself, to move to another place, conquer and Islamize it by degrees. And this is what's happening in Europe. There's no doubt. But for the first time now, I think we're seeing some very serious resistance. I expect that it's going to be difficult. It may well be impossible for free societies to be preserved in Europe, but in many places they're not going to go without a fight.
If we look at one of the strategies of jihad, is the replenishment or the repopulation by increasing by demand the number of children you have in order to penetrate societally. I'm Jewish. We certainly want to get back to pre-1939 levels. We're fighting desperately, 18 million, 14 to 14 million today, trying to get back. Christianity is suffering because the average Christian family is having 2 or less children. The average Muslim family is having 4 to 6 children. And so we're looking at just pure population statistics being impacted. But this is a strategic move. This is not just because of let's have more kids. This is actually a mandate for the advancement of jihad through something that we normally wouldn't call jihad, but it's part of the jihadist strategy, which you clearly identify as a multifaceted approach and one that's been applied throughout history that does not always mean the taking up of arms. And I
Right.
think we've been lulled into a false sense of security, into believing that if there's not violence associated with it, it is not jihad.
Yes, that's very true. And yet there is jihad that proceeds by nonviolent means to achieve the same end of imposing Islamic law and subjugating the non-Muslims under the hegemony of that law. And this is especially the preoccupation of the 10th and last chapter in the book, which is called, incidentally, the West loses the will to live. Because if there's anything that is the hallmark, the defining characteristic of the 21st century, it is that the chief enablers of the jihad today are not so much the jihadis themselves, but the non-Muslim leaders who give them entree, give them access, in some cases even give them directly money and weapons. Barack Obama was recently discovered to have been funding an al-Qaeda group in Sudan, and that was not even new in terms of his funding jihad groups, because he had been funding al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria against Assad in 2013. So if it weren't for non-Muslims and non-Muslim states that consider that it's somehow in their interest to aid the jihad would be at a considerable disadvantage. But it is advancing today by means of all sorts of nonviolent methods, including most notably the mass Muslim migration into Europe, and to a lesser degree, but nonetheless, still also here in North America.
As you look out over this, we've seen a dividing line forming within humanity. And that is, do we love our neighbor? Do we welcome our neighbor? And are we going to put a blind eye to the fact that as we look at these social constructs and we look at the penetration, London being classic, absolute picture-perfect classic, what happened in England, what happened with London with a Muslim mayor, now a Sharia court, now go and no-go zones. Now we have an entire model for what would love to be replicated in Dearborn, what would be love to be replicated in Dallas, what would love to be replicated in Atlanta. We think we can do something about it, but 15 years of history tells us that this is a force which is growing, and it is no different in its foundation than the platform that it's built upon has not changed in 1,500 years. It's adapted, but it's never changed.
Yes, that's very
factual?
important. That's actually, I think, one of the chief lessons of the book, that for all these centuries, Muslims have been at odds with non-Muslims. And this is not to say, of course, that every Muslim has always been a violent jihadi, or that they have all approved of it. This ought to be understood and taken for granted, but because of so many strong man arguments and so many mischaracterizations, I think it's necessary to repeat that. But in any case, it does not deny or negate the fact that for all these centuries, there has been jihad warfare. And everywhere Muslims and non-Muslims have lived in proximity, the Muslims have waged jihad against the non-Muslims. They have attacked the non-Muslims violently and unprovoked. Now, the theology that fueled this is still in place. Muslims today read the same Quran they've always read, and the Quran contains the same exhortations to violence that it always has. And the 14 centuries of that violence that I detail in this book, they were motivated by the ideology that Muslims today hold in the United States and in Europe. So why do we think it's going to be different here? Why do we think we are somehow going to escape conflict when this conflict has never been escaped by any non-Muslims who have come into contact with Muslims. Why do we think we're going to be different when there's been no reformation, no rejection, no reconsideration, no reform of the jihad exhortations in the Quran and the teachings on jihad in Islamic law?
When we look at those that are advancing this ideology, it comes from the pulpit, and it comes from the imams who are trained in advancing this. And it's so interesting that I don't think that any reporter would hesitate to walk into a synagogue and record a sermon by a rabbi. I don't think that there's any reporter in America that would have any concern whatsoever walking into a Baptist church and recording the sermon of a Baptist minister or a Catholic priest, or for that matter, anybody. But we are prohibited from entering into the mosque, and we are prohibited from recording or getting a dialogue or a narrative or a script of what is being presented. Now, I've interviewed many who have come out of Islam into Christianity that have many contacts, and in some cases they are not, we've disguised them on air so that their identity is protected, and they walk into the mosque in Los Angeles and they hear about jihad. They hear about from the imam who is having gatherings together and having sub-gatherings and still advancing the cause of jihad and the caliphate. Whether or not it is a Sunni caliphate or it is a Shiite caliphate is inconsequential when it comes to the Islamization of a country or the dominance of a population, government, or society. How do we continue to allow this where subversive anti-American agenda and even CAIR representatives will say that Sharia is above the United States Constitution? And
can't possibly tolerate it. The problem is there has to be a reckoning at some point that we have to decide whether the religious freedom that is granted to everyone in the First Amendment is a license to break other laws, or whether it ends where other laws begin. And it really ought to be common sense. The Founding Fathers never intended the religious freedom to be some sort of a poison pill that would destroy the republic. They intended it to be understood as within the limits of the other laws of the land. That if you are breaking a law of the land and you say, it's my religion, that's no excuse. But now there is widespread misunderstanding about this point, and the idea that because Islam purports to relate men to God, that therefore whatever they do is all right and it's freedom of religion. But if you have a religion that denies the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of rights of women with men, the equality of rights of non-Muslims with Muslims, these things are at variance with constitutional principles and at variance with existing American laws. It ought to be an open and shut case that those things cannot and should not stand within this country.
That is a perfect segue to our break. And when we come back from break, I want to have the conversation with you as to what defines an ideology versus a religion. And does the First Amendment actually protect ideologies versus religions? And if Islam is an ideology because it has a government ruling and adjudicating component to it, does it meet the test of pure religion? We're going to take a short break. We're talking with Robert Spencer, a man who hopefully my respect for him and admiration for his accomplishment and his contribution is emanating through this program to our audience around the world, that I hold him in very, very high regard. He's written the History of Jihad, from Muhammad to ISIS. Robert Spencer, you can subscribe to Jihad Watch. Just go to jihadwatch.com and get a daily report, and you're going to be fascinated by what's happening in the world around you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to answer that question. Is there a difference between an ideology and the true test of religion, and have we merged the two, thus confusing ourselves and becoming our own worst enemy? We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our 1-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Robert Spencer, author of the newly released book. I guess August the 7th is the official release date,
Yes,
but you can
right.
get it. You can get it now. I got it. If I can get it, you can get it. The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. Robert Spencer, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Great to be back. Thank you.
We went to break, and I brought up the question of ideology versus religion. Islam has been presented as a religion and classified as one of the world's religions. And I personally have a problem from that, coming from a Talmudic background, coming from a Torah background, coming from a Jewish background, that yes, within the confines of Judaism, we did have the tribunals, we did have adjudication of certain matters, but they didn't impact anybody who wasn't willing to be a part of that community. Okay? There was nothing that ever went outside the synagogue. So unfortunately, early when I was a young man, I had to get a Jewish divorce called a get, and I had to go before a tribunal. That was the authority that I had to present my case to in order to get this document granted, which was really like an annulment that would be in a Catholic church. This was the same kind of procedure. But that had no civil impact. There was no adjudication outside or enforcement outside those that were willing to be a part of it. Judaism was therefore a religion, a race, it was a people, it was a bloodline. When we look at Islam, we could say, okay, it's a faith system, a faith in a God, one God, monotheistic God, Allah, who is the God of Abraham through Ishmael, different than the God of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. So argument could be same God, not same God, doesn't really matter. Are they monotheistic? And do they conform to what we would construct as a religion? Or is there a political and social justice and other branches to it which transcend faith and move into government? And is there such a thing within Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Iran or other countries as a state religion? And I actually had the opportunity to look at the Declaration of Independence of, and I want to say it was Tunisia, and I had the guest on who was the author of it. And in the very first line, it said that we are a free democracy and the state religion is Islam. Those two things are opposed to each other. You can't have a state religion and be a democracy. So this was the argument that I had with this particular scholar in saying, well, it's great that you've got a Declaration of Independence and you've declared yourself as a democracy, but in the very next line, you've established a state religion. Now, maybe I'm coming at it from a Western point of view, which says in our Declaration of Independence that there will be no state religion. How do we make the distinction? Is Islam a religion, or is it a political or blended ideology that moves outside the bounds of religion, and should it receive the treatment of a religion as Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Christianity, or Judaism might also receive?
This is actually what I think could form the foundation for a way to deal with this legally that nobody has figured out thus far. And, you know, before the break, I was saying that people say it's a religion, so they have religious freedom, and you can't restrict their religious freedom, which means you can't restrict jihad plotting and the oppression of women and all these things that come from the Islamic law. The answer to the question, is it a religion or a political ideology, is actually it's both. A religion claims to relate human beings to the divine, and Islam does claim that. At the same time, Islam is unique among the religions of the world in having a political system, and that political system is considered to be just as much revealed by God as the religious requirements. So Muslims are forbidden to eat pork, and Muslims are also told that they ought to, by right, all be under the political power of a caliph, and that that caliph rules by the authority of Allah himself, cannot be questioned, and his system, Islamic law, is superior to all so-called man-made political systems. And this political system, Sharia Islamic law, is authoritarian, supremacist, violent, aggressive, and expansionist in its very nature. And so you have a political system that asserts that it is not only a political system, but the political system, the only one that is legitimate for all of humanity, and that it comes from the only true God, and that all other political systems are made by human beings and therefore inherently inferior, and that the Muslims are called the best of people. In the Quran, chapter 3, verse 110, says to the Muslims, "You are the best of people made for the earth, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong." And those two parts of that sentence are not separate. They are the best of people because they enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. In other words, a Muslim will understand when he studies the Quran and he is knowledgeable in his faith that the reason why the Muslims are the best of people is because they know what's right and wrong and we don't. Because the unbelievers, the Quran also says in chapter 98, verse 6, are the most vile of created beings. So we who are vile created beings, we fashion our own little man-made laws, but they have no comparison to the incomparable superiority of Islamic law, Sharia, which is the law of the best of people. So you have this ideology that's a political ideology that not only says that it's better than all the others, but also teaches the believers in it that they have a responsibility to fight everybody on earth until they submit to the authority of this political ideology. Now, that seems to me to be something that was never intended to have First Amendment protection and should not have. And people will say, oh, you're saying Muslims shouldn't have First Amendment protection? No, I'm not saying that. If you have a Muslim who wants to read the Quran and pray to Allah and do it 5 times a day and fast during Ramadan and all that, he's perfectly welcome to do that in the United States with nobody bothering him. But when you have a Muslim who wants to replace the Constitution with Sharia, deny the equality of rights of women, deny the equality of rights of non-Muslims, restrict the freedom of speech, impose a death penalty for those who leave the Islamic faith, those things are illegal under American law already. All we need to do is enforce our existing laws and recognize that religious freedom is not a license for breaking other laws, and that Islam does have these political aspects that are aggressive, assertive, supremacist, and violent, and consequently they do not have any place in the United States.
When the United States passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1952, it prohibited anybody from coming into this country that would commit themselves to any other ruling document that they considered to be above the Constitution of the United States. So if you came into our borders for citizenship, for immigration, you had to commit yourself to the Constitution as being the governing document under which you would be willing to live within these borders. Today we have a situation where we have an organization that says openly, declares that the Quran, that Sharia and the laws that are assigned to Sharia law are above the Constitution. And we do nothing about that because they're claiming First Amendment rights to be able to stand against the governing law in the country. So we have a country that's kind of embattled and embroiled in itself in a semantical kind of battle, looking to subject themselves to a louder voice. But your book does something that no other book does, and it chronicles without emotion pure history. It is historical, not hysterical, and clearly shows a pattern of 1,500 years of this coming into power and into place in every nation they have planted their feet. Now, biblically, I can take you back to the 12 provinces that God gave to Ishmael in recognition of his father, Abraham petitioning God for a blessing for his son, in addition to the blessing given to Isaac. I can also quote you that Ishmael was to be a wild donkey among men, and all the nations of the world would war against him, and he would war against his brothers, which tells us that this biblical prophecy is now in full force, and we can see that the biblical lines of the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ishmaelites, these are the nations and people who have become the biblical people groups of Islam, who have set themselves one against Israel, which is incredibly important both for the sustaining of the United States and the rest of the free world. But it also comes into play in every major event within Islamic history is their statement that any territory that was once under their rule is forever under their rule, meaning wherever they planted their feet, they own forever. That means that there's almost 2/3 of the globe which have been trampled upon by Islam over 1,500 years that technically they lay claim to.
Oh, yeah.
If
doubt about that.
If there is a time in American history where there is an entrenched Islamic community, would it not then be the de facto position that America would belong to Islam?
Oh, yeah. And as a matter of fact, there have been pseudo-historical claims already from Islamic groups that the original inhabitants of the U.S. were Muslim, that the Christopher Columbus's expedition saw minarets. And as a matter of fact, I believe it was in Cuba or the West Indies, one of the people on Christopher Columbus's ship says that we saw minarets from the shoreline. But he actually was working from his own experience from the Muslims in Spain, and they were not minarets and there were no Muslims. But these statements have been seized upon to claim that there was an early Muslim presence in North America. And they have an ominous undercurrent because that means then that this is Islamic land and belongs by right to them. Of course, the whole earth belongs to the Muslims as far as the Muslims are concerned. But to say that even in the founding of the United States, Barack Obama, when he said Muslims have been part of America's story from the beginning, which was false. And these false stories now that the African slaves were mostly Muslim. There were a handful of Muslims among them, but mostly they were not Muslim because the slavers who sold them to the American slave traders were Muslim. And they didn't sell their brothers and sisters, they sold non-Muslims. So most of the American slaves were not Muslim. But the whole idea of this historical revisionism is to create the idea that America was originally Islamic and is only returning to its original faith.
I believe there's a false narrative, especially in light of San Bernardino, where everybody said this young man, he was such a wonderful person, he was such a great neighbor, he was such a great friend, is part of a strategy of part of this immigration and migration strategy to blend into a community. And people say, but every Muslim I know is friendly. Well, they are friendly until they're not. They're friendly until they reach a percentage where when the mandate comes down from the caliphate, from whoever is heading the caliphate, that says, now turn against your neighbor, now set up revolution and communities which are go and no-go zones, that the punishment for the non-compliant Muslim will be death. And therefore we'll see that nice, wonderful neighbor that is now facing the extermination of their own family, subjecting themselves to Sharia and conforming to whatever the mandates of the Quran are.
I think it's very important to emphasize that what you're saying, we have seen this happen again and again. It's not some so-called Islamophobic narrative or hysteria. Recently, when the war in Syria started, in 2011, 2012, 2013, the New York Times actually ran a photograph that I picked up at Jihad Watch of a young man standing there with his mother, and they were Christians in Syria, And the story was that they had Muslim neighbors who they'd been friendly with for decades. But when the war broke out, the Muslim neighbors came and murdered their friend, the young Christian man, and destroyed the home of the family. There are stories like this going through Islamic history. I have one in one of my other books, so I didn't put it in this new one, of a woman in the Ottoman Empire when the Armenian genocide was beginning in the 1890s. And she said that her husband came home one night and he said he'd been at the mosque and the imam told him he had to kill their Christian neighbors. And she was shocked and appalled. They were a middle-aged family and they'd lived next door to these Christians for decades and had been friendly with them. And she said, "You can't kill our neighbors. They've been there. We've been to their home for dinner. They've been here. We've been friends with them." And he said, "I have to. The imam has ordered me." And he went over there and killed them. This kind of thing is unfortunately a recurring theme in the history of jihad, that Muslims and non-Muslims live together peacefully. There's coexistence, mutuality, until the time for the jihad begins. And then all bets are off.
Are we so arrogant, a nation, that we refuse to learn from history?
Yeah, I think so. But I have hope enough to have written this book. And the idea was to help us to learn from history. Most Americans, I'm sure, have no idea of any of this in this book. The first chapter is about Muhammad, and I think most people would figure, well, Muhammad founded a great world religion. He probably went around telling people to love one another. And he was actually a warlord, a killer. He had the 9-year-old wife. All these things, these are documented from the Islamic sources. And the community he founded, it originally was headed up in the first 30 years of its existence by 4 men in succession who were known as the rightly guided caliphs, the Khalifa Rashidun. And the rightly guided caliphs, they are supposedly the overseers of the Islamic Golden Age. Abu Bakr and then Umar and then Uthman and Ali. And 2 of them were murdered. And one of them faced a civil war rebellion from the Arab tribes who decided after Muhammad died that they were going to leave Islam. And he went around forcibly converting them back to Islam in what are called the Wars of Apostasy. And the other one faced a civil war from a general who didn't like him, and one of Muhammad's wives, Aisha, his child bride, who disliked him because she had been accused of adultery while Muhammad was still alive. And this caliph to be, Ali, said, "What do you care if she's executed? You can always find another woman." And she heard him say that and hated him forever. This is actually the origin of the Sunni Shiite split. So the point being that the Prophet was violent, the golden age of Islam was violent, the great caliphates after that, as I show in the book, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba in Muslim Spain, the Ottomans, they were all extraordinarily violent and brutal to non-Muslims. Why do we think it's all going to be different now? There's never been a reconsideration, as I said, a rejection of these doctrines. They still exist. So our experience is going to replicate the experience of history, and it's not going to be pretty.
What is the clarion call? We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left in the show for today. People are so confused. They are fed by mainstream media in the simplest of ways to believe that Allah is great as opposed to Allah is greater is the cry that's being cried around the world. We have become lazy in our education. It's not going to happen here. Christian persecution isn't going to happen here. But yet we saw it in the Oregon shootings. The young man said, "Are you a Christian?" "Yes." He shot you in the head. If you said, "Are you a Christian?" "No." He shot you in the leg. That's called Christian persecution if you're willing to die and you're shot for your faith. We're seeing, but we're not seeing a 9/11. So because we haven't seen another 9/11, we've become complacent and literally have ignored this. This is the battleground of border protection. This is the battleground of immigration reform and immigration and the protection of the American way. If we do not do something about it, it's not being fearmongers, it's being history learners, learning from 1,500 years of history that this is a pattern and a pathway to domination and subjugation of a nation, and America is not immune. What is the warning you can give to America today as to why they need to understand this now?
For 1,400 years, Muslims have been waging war against non-Muslims, subjugating them under the rule of Islamic law, forcibly converting them in many cases, making their lives so miserable that they converted just to get out from under all the oppression, discrimination, persecution, and harassment. And these things are still part of Islamic law. If you look in the book, there's never been a period of tolerance, a period of good feeling, of coexistence, of multiculturalism. None of these things happened. There are a lot of historical myths about them, but in reality, you look, it was never this way. It was always the Muslims must dominate and not be dominated, as Muhammad said. And the Islamic law always enabled the hegemony of the Muslims. So here we are with massive Muslim migration into the West, and these things are going to happen again. We need to call upon the Muslims who are already here to renounce these aspects of Islamic law that are at variance with American law or the laws of the lands in which they're residing. And we need to enforce our own laws so as to make sure that it's understood that these aspects of Islam are not welcome insofar as they subvert the principles of a free society. And if we don't do that, then we will certainly lose free societies.
Amen. Could not have said it better myself. We're going to talk with Robert Spencer, author of The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS, a New York Times bestseller right here. It will come out at the top of the charts. His other books have come out at the top of the charts. Credible, reliable, historical fact like you've never seen before. This should be college level, high school level. Every person should read this if they want to understand what our future in America looks like and what's in jeopardy, and why this issue of immigration, why this issue of border security, why this issue of vetting, why this issue of understanding who's coming into America. The same way my parents had to go through the same process of swearing allegiance to this country, so must all those who come into our borders. A must-read, The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS, fact-based, not emotional, taking you on a historical journey like you've never been before. Robert Spencer, thank you for being with us here on Revealing the Truth. God bless you, my friend.